Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to be reading you 4 true ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. Haunted Rooms for Rent, Toronto, Ontario. One chilly January day in 1886, a widow and her daughter moved their possessions into their new home. They were looking forward to living in the roomy upper floor flat they had rented in an old house on Gerrard Street in Toronto. The next morning, they were moving their things out of the house as fast as they could carry them. The first night there had been absolutely terrifying. The first thing they noticed was how cold the place was, even though they had managed to get a good fire going in the fireplace. Tired, they snuggled under extra bedclothes and eventually fell asleep. But not for long. Just before midnight, they were awakened by loud banging and slamming sounds downstairs. And then, even though their bedroom door was shut, a blast of wintry air blew through the room, lifting the blankets right off their bed. The mother went into the hall and called downstairs to Mr. Farrell, the owner who lived in the lower floor, asking him to shut the doors. But he had no idea what she was talking about. Worried that their imagination was playing tricks on her, the mother went back to bed, calmed her daughter down, and said they should try to get some more sleep. But sleep never came. A while later, a dark, mysterious shape drifted over the bed, leaving them trembling with fear, as did the thumping footsteps they heard moving along the hall. Mother and daughter clung to each other until dawn. Then they rose, got dressed, packed their bags, and left, telling Mr. Farrell that nothing could make them stay another minute in the upstairs flat they had hoped to call home. Dream Morning, Tagish Lake, Yukon. Tagish Lake is a long, narrow lake crossing the border between the Yukon and British Columbia. For hundreds of years, members of the Gwich'in Nation lived a nomadic life along its shores. Then gold was discovered at Bonanza Creek in 1896, and the Klondike Gold Rush began. Prospectors from the south started moving into and through the area. Today, the Klondike Highway follows the western arm of the lake in the Yukon, much as the prospectors did more than a century ago. Although the lake is rather isolated, it made news around the world after a large meteorite crashed into its frozen surface in January of 2000. A local resident, Jim Brook, collected the 200-gram meteorite and other smaller pieces of space rock and made them available to researchers. They were very excited by his find. The Tagish meteorite turned out to be the most pristine or uncontaminated meteorite they had ever analyzed, and it was the very first one they identified as having come all the way from a band of asteroids between Mars and Jupiter. The lake had also caught the interest of UFO, unidentified flying object researchers. In the early 1970s, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, reported seeing 7 large, round objects moving slowly in the sky over the lake. One of the men took a picture of the mysterious bright orbs, and the other sent the photo to weather officials in Ottawa in the hope of learning what the UFOs were. He was eventually told that any information about them was classified. But the most unusual event reported about the lake made the news back in 1916, when a somewhat strange article appeared in the Nome Daily Nugget, the daily newspaper at that time in Nome, Alaska. The article recounted how Don Mack, a mining engineer working in northern Canada and Alaska, had written to a woman named Ethel Williams to thank her for saving him from drowning in Tagish Lake. In this letter, Mack explained that he had been crossing the frozen lake by sled with 3 native men and a French Canadian when they decided to camp for the night on a small island. During the night, Mack had a vivid dream in which a young woman appeared. She identified herself as Ethel Williams of Syracuse, New York. and she warned him not to travel in the direction he planned to go the next day, because the snow-covered ice there was dangerously thin. When Mac awoke, the other men were packing up and getting ready to set off again, so he told them about his disturbing dream and suggested they follow a new route. But they just laughed at him and set off his plan, leaving him to continue on his journey alone. Mac wrote that he had detoured around the dangerous area he had been warned about by the apparition and made it safely to Skagway, but the 4 other men never showed up. Worried, he organized a search party to go back and look for them. Several days later, he was both saddened and stunned when he found the missing men's canoes and some of their gear floating in the lake's icy waters, very close to the place he had been warned to avoid. Mac and the other searchers presumed the 4 had drowned. Their bodies were never found. Back in his office in Juneau, Alaska, Mac couldn't get thoughts of his dream and his narrow escape out of his head. After doing some research, he learned that a young woman named Ethel Williams did indeed live in Syracuse, New York, and he couldn't resist writing to her. He wanted to thank her for saving his life. Someone in Ethel's family, perhaps Ethel herself, was so amazed when the letter arrived that it was reported to a local newspaper, and the article that appeared was eventually picked up by the Nome Daily Nugget. Ethel had been astounded when she read the letter because she had never heard of Don Mac or Tagish Lake, and she had obviously no way of knowing the ice conditions there in the late fall. But apparently Mac had met her once, in a dream he would never forget. Night Vision, North Atlantic Ocean. In the 1930s, Joseph Boyd, a sea captain from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, told folklorist Helen Creighton about a dream that he would never forget. He had been serving as his brother's first mate on a sailing ship bound for New York in the late 1890s when his brother told him about a frightening dream he had just had. In it, several sailors were tied to the rigging of a badly damaged, wave-swept ship, their hands outstretched as if pleading for help. Joe kept thinking about the dream as he went through the stormy morning's tasks. Finally, for no good reason he could think of, he made the tricky climb up the rigging and scanned the churning waves. To his amazement, off in the distance he spotted a foundering vessel with all but one mast gone, and with men with outstretched arms tied to the rigging. Joe shouted out the order to change course, and after hours of hazardous maneuvering, the crew of his ship managed to rescue 16 sailors perilously close to death, and Joe was convinced they would have died if it hadn't been for his brother's dream. Sadly, some members of the shipwreck crew had been washed overboard when the storm's fury first hit. Perhaps the dream was a last desperate effort by the ghost of one of those drowned men to save his fellow sailors before he journeyed into eternity. A Deadly Drive, Fredericton, New Brunswick. The brutal murder of taxi driver Norman Philip Burgoyne in January of 1949 sent shockwaves of horror through Fredericton, New Brunswick. Just 34 years old when he was killed, Burgoyne was married and the father of 3 young children. His wife reported him missing when he didn't return home after answering a Friday night call for the taxi from the Canadian Legion Hall. 3 days later, his body was found stuffed into the trunk of his cab at the southeastern outskirts of the city on Wilsey Road. Norman's killers had badly botched their efforts to conceal their crime, leaving behind plenty of clues to their identities, and it took police just a couple of days to find them. Rufus Hamilton, aged 22, and his brother, George, 23, were charged with the murder. During their trial, George told the court how Rufus had bludgeoned Burgoyne with a hammer. Then they had robbed him. The Hamiltons were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Both sentences were carried out on the same day in July of 1949. There are those who believe that the two young men, united by their deaths just minutes apart, remain together in the afterlife, and that their ghosts still haunt Fredericton. The Hammer brothers, as they came to be known, have been reported wandering through some of the city's back alleyways. They have been thumbing a ride into town, but no one will stop to pick them up, especially not along Willsey Road. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.